freedom of the media representative was particularly dear to my heart for action, of course, but not least because she was for a while my former boss. My name is Emmanuelle Maché. I'm the secretary to the EPRA, the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, which is a network of cooperation between 53 broadcasting regulators in Europe. And I will moderate this panel on the issue of new media and regulation, which will have a particular focus on content regulation, and will as well be approached from the particular angle of broadcasting. Most of the participants of the panel revolve around the word of broadcasting. Let me start with two milestones and two buzzwords. Milestones, 1997 and 2012, and the buzzword convergence and connected TV. So in 1997, a green paper on convergence of the telecom, media and information technology sector was published by the European Commission, announcing the imminence of convergence of the communication and calling for a complete review of the regulatory framework. And then the next milestone is 2012, which was the year of the connected TV debate. I think we lost count of the number of conferences about this topic. It is estimated that by 2016, at least a fifth of all TV sets in the world will be connected to the internet. And against this background, there are again voices urging to review the regulatory framework so that the same content delivered in a connected TV screen is not subject to different regulatory regimes. A strict one for the broadcast, a more relaxed regime for the on-demand services, and a largely unregulated for the services coming from the internet. The objective of this panel, we are here today to have a discussion on the future of media regulation and this applicability or not to new media services. Since the adoption of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive in 2007, that for the first time included non-linear, on-demand new media services on the scope of content regulation at the European Union level. There were many broadcasting regulators since then that have had their eyes practically focused on a microscope to determine whether this particular service, this particular app, is in the scope or not of the legal framework applying to broadcasting. But today we propose to take a bird's view instead of this looking at details, and have a look first at the purpose and rationale of regulation. In other words, why should we or should we not regulate new media? Second, look at the pros and cons of extending content regulation to new media services, and the interplay, of course, which is very important, with the fundamental rights. So in other words, how far should we regulate? And as a third point, look at the issue of the proper regulatory mix. So self-regulation, co-regulation, traditional regulation. So address the question as to how regulate. So I realize, of course, it's quite an ambitious program in 1.5 hours session. But however, we have here an excellent panel. Just briefly introduce the panelists. Well, to my right, Ross Bigham. Ross is the Director General of the Association of Commercial Television in Europe, the ACT, And this association, the ICT, represents 33 media companies from 37 European countries. And Ross worked previously at the ITV, a British television channel. Then, to my left, Tim Sutter was a consultant for strategy, media policy and regulation with his company Perspective Associates. But Tim in the UK's media and communication regulator, the Ofcom. And before, he had a 15 years career at the BBC as a producer, editor, and reporter. Then on my left, Jean-François Furnemont was the Director General of the CSA of the French-speaking community of Belgium, the regulatory authority for broadcasting. He's as well chairman of the EPRA network since 2011. And he has as well a background in journalism studies and is a former freelance journalist. Last but not least, my colleague Suzanne Nicole-Chef was head of department of the legal information at the European Audiovisual Observatory, which is based in Strasbourg. She's a coordinator and editor of the well-known IRIS, Legal Observation, of the European Audiovisual Observatory, as well as other publications. And before, she had a career as a lawyer in media, telecom, international trade and EU competition with an American law firm, Covington and Burling. So here is the composition of our panel. Just a few words about the structure. We will have first introductory keynote by Suzanne, setting the question for the debate. And then we'll have a panel with the remaining three panelists, and then we'll open the debate with the floor. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And actually, before I say any further, I become an extended arm of the OSCE people and announce hereby that you should please switch off your Wi-Fi links, so that not all the capacity is being used, while you should anyway be listening to us. So please, if you could be so kind to do that. And then I want to join Emmanuel in thanking the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to be here and to share some thoughts with you on this question, how far should we regulate new media services? And when preparing for today, I actually was rather a bit worrying and saying, isn't it that we maybe too easily agree? After the morning session, we could think maybe the proper place here is to say no, by no means any regulation of the internet. Others, being in the day-to-day practice, might have the opposite view. But in any event, I thought I want to add a little grain of salt to the discussion, and I found a little quote that I think does so for me. Let's just change a little bit the perspective and be a bit provocative without that being an official observatory slogan, because the observatory, you should know, is there to observe, not to make policies. And we really abstain from that, but as my role is to lead you into the topics, you might sometimes find that there are arguments for and against, and I think that's what I should be doing. So let's ask ourselves, it was felt that regulation was also needed for other services that had meanwhile emerged and that were then labeled non-linear audiovisual media services, services comparable to television. And this new regulatory step was addressed by the Audiovisual Media Service Directive. Now, the new directive in principle kept the core rules of its predecessor for just enlarging for comparable services. It softened a bit the rules that had so far been valid for broadcasting, because it was felt there was less need in certain areas, and it declared to be technology neutral, so to not care how television gets into your home and how on-demand services get there. And it opened the way for co-regulation. looked at as a less restrictive regulatory means, and also a means that would allow to involve more those who are regulated. Now, what might be the reasons why we look for more regulation today if we do so? Do we pursue other policies? Do we see new cross-border issues? Or is a quote from George Bernard Shaw actually behind all of that? He said, "Liberty means responsibility. That is why most men dread it." Now, do we contemplate more regulation because media do not resume the responsibility that correlates to the media freedoms? Now, this question I'd like to a little bit illustrate with a concrete example, and that leads us now to talk a little bit about pornography. Now, why is pornography such a good example? You find lots of pornographic content on the internet. It's also offered by numerous on-demand services, which therefore form an important and clearly a cross-border market. So to regulate these services means to limit the freedom of information, as well as the freedom to provide business and the right to property. Now, these limitations are normally accepted for the sake of protecting the rights of children and public interests, particular public morals. And if you have especially violent or extreme pornography, they might even be needed to protect human dignity, often or mostly of women, and also possibly the right to live free from sexual violence. Now, European regulation concerning pornographic content looks roughly like this table, meaning you have a ban for illegal content. And we had in the morning session a bit an idea how difficult it is already to define what is illegal. This was the scalpel approach that we heard in the first presentation. And if you go outside the scope of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, you'll actually have to see that it's only banned if it comes to child pornography, that you have a couple of conventions who say so. For the rest, you have a graduated approach, which depends on the kind of media concerned. And then you have still to have in mind that all of this needs to be transposed into national laws, and there you have lots of varieties as to the outcomes. If you look at the blank fields of this table, it becomes clear why pornography triggers a regulation debate. The more children are confronted with violent and extreme pornography on the internet, the more the debate heats up. Now, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recommends a comparative study on the relevant national laws and regulations, and it considers a more harmonized approach. They would like to have actually a feasibility study for a common system of classification content descriptors. So ideally, you would have a system where you can compel companies to pre-label all the content before they put it anywhere to commercial distribution. But this is not the only need for regulation that is uttered by parliaments. The European Parliament, too, pushes for some actions with regard to promoting pluralism. So regulatory actions, if you so want, in the field of media freedom to promote something, the pluralism. Now, a series of related EU finance studies have just recently published, and that gives you a little bit of feeling. I could go on with other examples. But not everybody, of course, is for regulatory action for various reasons. One is, and this was not yet talked about in the morning maybe, that it would hamper the prospering of the audiovisual sector because it stifles development if you have too many rules. And then, of course, it is, and that was very much already emphasized and stressed, curtailing fundamental freedoms, even when it's done for a good cause. Now, still, let's stay with the idea being discussed of possibly widening the scope of existent content regulation. Now, could we arrive, for example, at a system of horizontal content regulation applicable across all media? Now, definitely, you could make a case for protecting certain vulnerable groups with a minimum set of rules, irrespective of the kind of audiovisual media concerned. And that's very simple. If you think of content that we don't like our children to watch on television, you wouldn't want them to find that on the internet. Content spreading hate and discrimination is also unwanted on other media for the same reason. consumers should not be tricked in any way, no matter what media they use. We could maybe also just agree on that. Now, in fact, isn't then our problem not that we cannot agree on content regulation, as I think we can to some extent? Does it not rather sit with the trouble of monitoring and enforcing rules, especially on the internet, and especially because the internet has this global reach? Now, likewise, now we go in the positive action that is also limiting freedom of information, but for a valuable policy goal. But could we not also then think that certain values should be actively promoted in the media with the help of the media, no matter what media? For example, if media is considered a form for democracy, does it really matter where it takes place? Should we not have diversity and pluralism everywhere? Do we need regulation for that? And then, if you are going so far with me to agree on all of this, then you still have one big argument against the horizontal regulation, and that is indeed monitoring and enforcement, because if you cannot monitor nor enforce, why would you regulate? Also, another issue is once you start expanding regulation beyond the current scope of the directive, maybe you also have to address internet service providers and device manufacturers, because they too play an important role in determining what content gets to whom. So would you really want to go and risk this to go so far? So where do we put a stop to content regulation if we engage in that is the open question. And this also leads us a little bit to the next step, which is who will stop us? Now, we have said various times regulation limits fundamental freedoms, and therefore it always brings you into fundamental rights debate. And this is, as with pornographic content, sometimes allowed if you want to protect certain other high-ranking rights or general public interest. Think of licensing of broadcasting, a heavy regulation, a heavy limit on freedoms. It was done in order to come to terms with the means that were available that you had to distribute in the correct way. And this was, in a way, in order to promote Article 10. Now, what would be today possibly the constitutional argument to justify the widening of the scope of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive? Are there any? One could think of that the complex system that we have today to already distinguish various services is a reason itself, because it creates legal uncertainty and unequal treatment. When you think of the criteria that are used to determine really what comes under the directive and what is out, you can ask yourself the question, are these elements well chosen? For example, I just give you some of these elements. How about economic activity, editorial responsibility, or provision of programs as principal purpose? Are these good criteria for legal certainty? Are they really sufficiently determined? Who will judge this? Is equal treatment in there? Does that play any role when it's being looked at, how we fill in these elements? But then again, we have the counter elements also against changing the regulatory settings for other reasons. You have the struggle in offering these, sacrificing the freedom of services so far not regulated to justify that the current system is not working well. It's so complicated, so if you apply it to everybody, it's less complicated. It's maybe not a very good line of arguments. And even so, it would do away with this graduated two-tiers approach, which in itself would have a certain beauty for the consumer because he would know more what to expect. Now, different media might, however, also have a different impact, and different means are therefore available also to address them, largely also due to the technology available. So in other words, what might work to ban pornography from the television screen will maybe not be adequate for the internet. And then human rights law does require that before you impose any limits, that you look at what is necessary and proportionate. So you see, you can have a whole debate, and I hope we have it to some extent, about the pros and cons of more or different, for example, more harmonized regulation. So what do we conclude from all of this? I just think that we can maybe agree that there are some needs that led to regulating broadcasting that have disappeared, the scarcity argument I mentioned before, but most regulatory needs for broadcasting remain in place, at least for broadcasting, people seem to agree, and they are not in any way addressed for new media services. So here we have a question what to do. The lawmaking process seems also unable to cope with the speed of technological development, which I think is a big problem. The technology-neutral regulation might mean something very different today than it did in the past, and the directive is not really, even so it declared to be very technology-neutral. It only is so with regard to the various transmission modes for media services, but it already applies different content rules depending on whether an audiovisual service is linear or non-linear, and if it's else, it fails to address them all together. Now, for new media services, the regulatory needs go far beyond the borders of the European Union. So the cross-border issue that led to regulation in the first place is there again in a different shape. What do we do with this? And then there is one constant in all this equation, and that's maybe the consumer. He remains. He is the one whom we want to protect, be it in form of minors or real consumers or other minority groups. And there is then, of course, now an increasing focus on what would the consumer want. Would he really want all this variety? Is that not too complicated for him? But then, on the other hand, we hear often, and maybe rightfully so, that there is something called media literacy that should be there to counter that particular problem. Now, some regulatory needs can be sufficiently addressed by other areas. We have competition law, we have criminal law. When you look in that, and we did so in a recent, rather big study, you find, however, that competition law, in essence, deals with economic goals, and rather, if at all, as a side effect with human rights issues. So maybe it's not very well suited to address certain deficiencies of a media system. Nor is criminal law, because that only cuts the edges, and if you have the wish to promote a certain public policy, maybe it's not suited at all. So this leads then to my final question as to if there is potential need for regulation, and also maybe positive regulation, pro-freedom, more freedom, who will stop the regulator? And with this question, I think I can hand over or back to Emmanuel.
Thank you, Suzanne, for an excellent presentation or explaining, opening the debate, the pros and cons on why regulate, where the reason in the past for regulating broadcasting, the reason that's been for slightly expanding the scope to on-demand services, and now the argument on whether or not there should regulation should go, content regulation should go further today. And the pro and cons of horizontal approach to regulation, and at the same time not forgetting the very importance of the fundamental rights debate and the constitutional issues. So maybe then we open directly, before we open the discussion with the floor, to our panelists. So Ross, so what is your immediate reaction to Suzanne's introduction, and could we have maybe your view on the why and how far new media should be regulated?
Yeah. Thanks, Emmanuel. Thank you also to the OSCE for the invitation to be here. Yeah, as Emmanuel said, I speak on behalf of European TV companies in 37 countries, so we're the people who are at the sharp end, if you like, of the regulation that we talk about. Just a few points really in response to what Suzanne said. Firstly, why do we regulate? It seems to me there are two. I think if you look across all the European markets, I think there are probably two main reasons that you can see having continuing validity into the medium term. The first of these is capacity constraints. Perhaps surprisingly, that hasn't gone away. People talk a lot about how the internet has unlimited capacity, but at the moment, in most European countries, it's still about 93 or 95% of video is consumed on broadcast systems, on cable, satellite, terrestrial, rather than via IP. So the internet may technically abolish capacity constraints, but there's still something there in the consumer market. And certainly in the bigger European member states, there is more demand for slots on the digital terrestrial network than there are slots available. So there's not the same capacity constraints as there were 10 years ago, but there is still something there. There is still something of a bottleneck. So I think one could accept a degree of regulation around that. The second point is news, and at the moment, television news is still the main way by which European citizens get their information about local and international politics. The internet is having some impact, but television still remains by far the dominant way in which people access their news and learn about the world around them. And I think in that context, one can see there is a case there for continuing regulation of the broadcast sector. I think many of the other reasons why we've historically been regulated may fade away over time. I think those two will remain valid. I wonder whether we could also add a third one to the list, which is what we've come to Vienna to talk about, which is media freedom. I've been working in Brussels for some years now, and I confess that media freedom was not very high on our agenda for a long time. That's changed in recent years, partly through the work that Dunya and her team have done in boosting the profile of media freedom issues, along with others like the Council of Europe in recent years. But also, whatever one's view of the recent Hungarian media law, whether or not you share the consensus that it was a draconian intervention or not, it has certainly put media freedom issues firmly on the agenda, also in Brussels and in Strasbourg. It may seem rather counterintuitive to argue that one should legislate to encourage freedom. It seems a little odd, but the European structure that we have is actually having some effect on the ground. Certainly, those of you who've worked in the Western Balkans or other pre-accession territories will know that the European Commission is regarded as a kind of neutral arbiter and someone that can weigh in on the side of the journalists, of the media companies who are coming under pressure from governments, and not just in the traditional ways either of imprisoning journalists and seeking to influence the bulletins, but by channeling government advertising towards favourable media, that sort of thing. So I think there may be ways, perhaps peculiar to the European system, where you have a layer of regulation then implemented by the member states, but there may be ways in which media freedom could find its way onto the list of reasons why we regulate the broadcast media. There's been a lot of talk already about new and old media and linear and non-linear services. And I think the point I would like to make is that I think both of those are false dichotomies. New and old media, well, I mean, the companies I work for, people like RTL, Canal Plus, Sky B, would firmly reject the appellation of being old media companies. These are companies who are basically more active than anybody else in Europe in terms of providing online services, be it catch-up TV, be it sort of standalone internet channels. And I think as we're seeing businesses active in both established television and online, clearly if the consumer demand is to move more online, that's where the business is going to go as well. So I think it's going to be very difficult to keep this sort of old-new media distinction meaningful. Just to give you one very simple example, there's a current initiative in Germany where ProSieben, one of the big commercial broadcasters, is putting funding into user-generated content. And the idea is that if you wanted, they might say that they might make available a slot on one of their channels for a show about gardening, and rather than doing the conventional thing of getting an independent producer to make it for them, they will put a small amount of money into perhaps the top 10 user-generated gardening sites, and then that will eventually develop, and then there'll be a kind of competition on their social media site, and then the most successful one, the one that gets the most votes, will be made into a program. So the same bit of content has gone from being user-generated content to being social media, to being on-demand, to being linear broadcast content, with all being the same basic format. Somebody sitting in his shed talking about how he looks after his garden. So I think, the very black and white, linear, non-linear distinction, I think, is something which is going to come under pressure. It's also going to come under pressure because of the timescales involved. The AVMS directive took about 3 years of drafting, a further 2 years of negotiation, and then 4 years of implementation. And just it's an anecdote, but it maybe has some symbolic value, that the AVMS directive was proposed in December 2005, which was the same week that Google bought YouTube. So the directive while the directive was being drafted, nobody had heard of this thing called YouTube and user-generated content. And the directive was finalised in 2007, which was before catch-up television had been invented. The BBC iPlayer was launched in December of that year. So you see that the pace at which international negotiations take place to establish these norms means that what we decide as being new media while we're negotiating a directive has already become part of the established context by the time the directive comes to be implemented. And certainly, Emmanuel's already mentioned connected TV, this hybridization of the internet and television. It's quite possible to have a single screen there showing content which we regulated in 5 different ways. If you have linear television, on-demand content delivered via the electronic program guide, the viewer's own content, photographs, music, etc., which is not regulated at all, and then audiovisual content delivered by the printed press, which has a sort of curious status under the AVMS directive of being neither in nor out. So it's not a simple linear versus non-linear. There are at least 5 different ways in which the same content can fall to be regulated or not. Final comment, again, it touches on something that's already been said this morning. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive, for those who aren't familiar with Brussels, is regarded as being the be-all and end-all of European media regulation, and the date of 1989, when the directive was first conceived, is regarded as being year zero in media law. In fact, what happened in 1989 was, because of technological change, because satellites had made transfrontier television possible, the member states came together and decided they had to have a European layer on top of the existing national legislation. I mean, until that date, media legislation was basically national. The technology has now moved from being continental, pan-European, to global. And the same logic should, at least in theory, apply, that we would now be looking for a thin global layer of standards. Clearly, we're not going to be sitting down and negotiating detailed standards about what content is acceptable at a global level, because that just won't work. But my question would be whether there are some basic notions, maybe centered around editorial responsibility, that we could agree would work across all media players and all territories. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ross, for your intervention. Your rationale about broadcast regulation. I wonder if Tim would react to that, would see as well kind of same argument and see the new old media as a false dichotomy, and your reaction as well to Suzanne's opening presentation as well.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and of course thank you to the OSCE for the invitation to take part in this important and interesting conversation about the future of regulation. Just to pick up Ross's point about the false distinction between old and new, that is clearly demonstrably true. We're talking about different means of distribution rather than the underlying content. The media itself is typically the same media, simply being distributed in a different way, but by the same people who are finding different business models to do it. So there's something in there about the future, which is about investing in and supporting the ethos, ethics, institutional behavior of organizations who, on the whole, want to do the right thing because doing the right thing is what attracts their audiences to them. So maybe that's for the second half of this discussion. Like everybody else, I suppose I'll try and have a go at why I think we regulate and why I think those reasons are being undermined. I suspect there are, for me, there are 3 reasons why we regulate television, 3 broad outcomes that we want to achieve. The first is around access, where we want to make sure both that audiences have access to particular services and content, and we want to make sure that particular services and content have access to the audience. And we achieve that through a variety of different means. Some of them are like competition law, others of them are more public interest interventions. But the fundamental reason here is that we want to make sure that our consumers and citizens have the fullest possible access to the range of views, discussions, debates, so that they can be full partakers of a democratic discourse and fully participating in what society and the market has to offer them. And so that's the first reason that we have regulated these services. The second reason, I suspect, is to do with protection. We want to ensure that particular audiences are protected from particular kinds of content, inappropriate content for vulnerable audiences. And we want to ensure that individuals are protected from inappropriate practices in the way that material is gathered or disseminated. Protection for people's privacy, protection against unfair or damaging content or comment. And increasingly added to that is a strand of consumer protection as television services become more closely related to more straightforwardly consumer-based services. Then there's a strand of consumer protection. It's always been there through rules around the appropriateness of advertising, but there are other ways in which consumers are protected that have been a focus of broadcasting regulation. And then the third reason for broadcasting regulation is what I would describe as contribution regulation. It's to ensure that particular services make a particular contribution in a particular way to the culture, to the market, to the generation of particular kinds of content or the support of particular kinds of production. And this has typically been achieved by imposing quotas on broadcasters to provide a certain amount of material of a particular kind or to distribute their production resources in a particular way around the country or to ensure that they are meeting local needs through local services, meeting indigenous needs through particularly targeted services, and so on. So there's a third strand there that is about ensuring that broadcasting makes a particular contribution. So I think those are the three goals of broadcasting regulation, and the question going ahead is how many of them are still relevant in future. The first, I echo what Ross says. I think the first around access is relevant, although the ways in which it is to be achieved may be different in a more distributed media world, but there will still be a need to ensure that audiences have access to a full range of services and that a full range of services are not prevented from reaching audiences through unfair or distorted market competition. So access rules will still matter, and how we update and upgrade the protections that have typically been offered to public service broadcasters through the must-carry rules is something that we'll have to look at quite carefully when we go into content on its own is actually meaningless, relatively meaningless, unless it is illegal content. If it is legal content, it is relatively meaningless until you know the context in which it was distributed and consumed. A particularly offensive image in a news broadcast may be entirely appropriate, but will be wholly inappropriate in a program that was aimed at children. But the same image, the same piece of content. So regulating for inappropriate content when you divorce the context is a very much harder thing to do. The third issue around contribution, I really do think this is a television issue. This is not an online issue. Clearly there have been attempts to ensure that distributors of online material make significant contributions towards promotion of and protection of particular kinds of production and particular kinds of content. But it seems to me that we are more likely to ensure that that happens by ensuring the health and vitality of those who are incentivized to create great audiovisual product in the first place and ensuring that they have a route to market in an online world rather than attempting to replicate those kinds of broadcasting style rules. I suppose, why did we regulate television? there are three reasons we regulated television. The first was, of course, scarcity, which we've heard about, and scarcity hasn't gone, but it was the real reason that we regulate television. It was something to do with the ubiquitous power of the medium, the fact that, you know, television is in everybody's room, it's there, everybody's got it, and linked to that is the unpredictability of the linear schedule. The removal of choice from the consumer, the choice is imposed upon them by those who have created a linear schedule. You can't scan down the page and decide which content you're going to go to. You get the content that the producer or editor has decided that you will get. And these factors created a particular view of the power of television as a medium, which justified why it needed to be regulated. Access to scarce resources and a particular inherent power in the medium. Linked to that is the point about the fact that in the broadcaster, you have a unique combination of those who control the content and the context. You have the single guiding mind who can, on whom you can hang everything. You can pin everything on the broadcaster. In an online world, it's very difficult to find who is that person. Who is the person to whom this would rightly attach itself? As Suzanne says, you've got a whole host of characters that you might decide you ought to be attaching regulation to. It's very hard to know who is the right one. Which brings me to my concluding observation, which is that this really comes down to a question of almost of regulatory philosophy. Do you want to be a neat regulator or a neat system where you ensure that there are no irregularities and that everything is dealt with equally and evenly? Or do you want to be lumpy and bumpy and uneven? Myself, I prefer lumpy, bumpy and uneven, because I think that the first approach is one which attempts to capture everything. It says, if it looks like a dog, it barks like a dog, it is a dog. Well, it may not be a dog. I watched some desperate clip show on the aeroplane coming over last night where they had, you know, those things where people, you know, sort of mock-up TV where people play pranks on people. And there was somebody pretending to be a dog, and you know what? He wasn't a dog. He was actually a person. The truth is that if you try to capture everything, you will almost certainly fail, because there will always be ways in which content is produced, distributed, consumed, that will evade your regulation, and the regulator will be constantly running to catch up and be permanently out of breath. Whereas, if you say the goal of regulation is to ensure that there are places in the media environment where good things happen and are protected, and where you can be guaranteed particular outcomes and particular approaches through a powerful combination of institutional ethics and regulatory support, then that has a very powerful effect within the market. It doesn't prevent other things happening elsewhere, and it doesn't absolve regulators from ensuring that in relation to access and protection, they are doing what they can. But it does ensure, but it avoids trying to relate everything across the whole market. Because, as I say, I think that is a recipe for exhaustion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for bringing us to a very philosophical and core questions. I wonder, Jean-François, you're a broadcaster here. Would you... a regulator, excuse me. This is a regulatory capture.
Broadcast capture.
Would you prefer to be a neat regulator or lumpy, bumpy, and even regulator? Would you agree that only some of the objective of broadcast regulation are still valid in this new media environment?
Well, I think sometimes probably we are numpy-bumpy, but maybe we don't do it on purpose. But, first of all, let me tell you that if I'm chairing EPRA, I'm not going to give you the voice of EPRA because it's just impossible. Ross mentioned that he has 37 members. at the ACT, we have 53 members coming from 47 countries and territories who are members of EPRA. So how could I give you the voice of all these members? So I'm going to give you just one voice, which of course is fed by what I know and what I hear from our members, but it's not their view. It would be, of course, impossible, especially when it comes to cultural issues. So, first question is why should we regulate new media at all? And to answer this question, I think we could have a look at things that don't change in the media environment. And I think no matter the kind of media, there's no room for hate speech and assaults on human dignity in any kind of media. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that also people, families, children want to be protected against some kind of content, and no matter on which screen they look at it, it remains relevant. They also need to be protected against some kind of commercial practices on any screen. We need also regulation on different platforms, because the question of the balance between public broadcasting and private broadcasting remains relevant, and it is evolving every day. So we need to rebalance this balance between that is always moving between public and private broadcasting. I think we also still need regulation, because without appropriate regulation, some kind of media might completely disappear. It can be local media, community media. We've done some work at EPRA last year and also during this year on how regulators can help to make community media flourish, and we see that without the help of regulators, it's getting very difficult for them to survive and to still find a place in the market. And the last reason why it's already been said by others, why we want regulation, is that I think we all still wish to have European content that is produced, that is promoted, that is distributed, and this is, of course, finally viewed by the viewers. And I think all this is not that much of a burden, be it for traditional media or for new media. And I think also we should not forget that if we have a directive now which encompasses traditional and new media, well, it comes also, it's of course, it might be a burden to enter the scope of new media, but it comes also, we should not forget that it comes with a reward. It's the fact that you have access to an internal market. The AVMS directive is mainly an internal market directive, and it's an opportunity to enter the scope of the directive, because then you don't have to knock at the door of 27 or 30 or 35 different regulatory authorities. You knock at the door of one of them, and then you have access to the 27 market. So it remains an opportunity. And I think we should also not forget that if we have this scope, that it was because there was some concern about from traditional broadcasters to see new players entering the market, and to be one day maybe in the position where there is no more level playing field, like in this tennis match, between traditional regulated players and non-regulated players. That doesn't mean that this legacy regulation that I've been talking about doesn't need to adapt, of course. But I think we should all remind ourselves that the goals of media regulation are enduring, relevant, and necessary. This is not from me. This is my tribute to a recent speech that Tim made in Brussels. So the second question is how far we should regulate these new media. And to answer this question, I think we could try to have a look at things that do not change that fast. And I'll give two examples. The first examples will be about what NRAs, regulators are doing here now. And here I think I can talk on behalf of all of our members. I think none of them are asking and have been asking in the review process of the directive and will be asking in the future if it's reviewed in the future for expanding their powers. We're not asking for more scope. It's absolutely not true. And actually, we are already having enough difficulties in implementing the directive with the scope it has now. We have a lot of difficulties in implementing it, and that is why most of our members are having quite a passive attitude towards new media services. That is also why you'll see very few guidelines on the scope, because the scope of the directive can be interpreted in different ways in different countries, and you see very few guidelines. You have, of course, the work of ADVOD in the UK, and then you have, I think, 3 countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Italy, who made guidelines and on the scope of the directive. And if you look at them, you really realize that when we make guidelines, they're quite restrictive on the scope. So I think it's another proof that we don't want to expand to these new media. And also, we are facing this terrible tension between the lack of resources we have and this scope, which is getting much bigger. Let's not forget that the directive, it's 2007, implemented in all countries 2 years later, 2009. And what happened in between these 2 days? Well, the crisis, October 2008, and crisis also for all public services. So all of us are doing way much more with way less resources, and it's really a problem. My second example would be, maybe we should go back to the basic of public policy in regulating broadcasting. I think we should not underestimate the changes that are happening in the market, but I think we should not overestimate them either. We often hear about these global players, over-the-top players who are entering our market. Well, if you look at these slides, and the next one, they're coming from Analysis Mason. Pay TV OTT, you see it, it's the pink one at the very top. And even for and if you look at the forecast for the next 5 years, you see that it remains not that much. That means that linear TV remains very strong, and I think all the studies show that it's the case. Video viewing represent less than 4% of linear TV viewing. If you look at advertising, you see that advertising is not also shifting that fast. Advertising remains between 2 and 6% of total TV advertising in new media. And why should it shift? I mean, the viewers are still in traditional media, so why would advertising shift? So we can have really a lot of forecasts that show that the market is not moving that fast. We're talking about young people who don't watch TV anymore. Well, young people are going to get old and have a family and go back to that good old screen one day. We have this fabulous attraction for live events that will always be on traditional television. If you look at how people use smartphones and tablets, well, actually 40% of the usage of smartphones and tablets are in front of TV. If you look how people react with their smartphones and tablets, what are the most popular thing they react to? It's TV shows. They like it, they tweet about it, etc. So I think all these shows, and it has been said by so many players, and I took just 2 examples, the president of the ACT and the CEO of RTL Group. President of the ACT said, rather than threatening the future of television sector, internet is unleashing our full potential. And this was confirmed recently by Guillaume de Poche, the new CEO of RTL Group, who said, I'm much more confident than 5 years ago about the future of traditional television. Well, what does this mean for regulators? Well, this means that we are there to implement some public policy goals. So let's not forget that there is still that traditional TV market that remains strong, and why would we want to go beyond the scope of the directive? Would we want to go so far, since it's getting quite difficult now and probably in the years to come to find so many important public policy issues to media that are not viewed as much as traditional media?
Thank you, Jean-François, for kind of showing us, reminding us of the resilience of linear TV, and for a note about the 30% use of tablet in front of television. 40, yes? Did I say 40? And that some public policy concerns remain, but are not all to be broadened to new services, and there's no strong regulatory appetite from the broadcast regulators to extend the scope and regulate internet. Maybe before we look, ask the panelists about the how would be the new regulatory ecology, how it could be in practice. Maybe we could open with a few discussion from the question from the floor on the presentation we've heard until now. Do you have any questions? Stala?
University of Amsterdam. I'd like to thank all of the participants, first of all, for opening this up so nicely in their different interventions. And I'd like to focus on a phrase, if not a philosophy, that Tim has articulated, namely the powerful combination of institutional ethics and regulatory support. I think you've phrased it very nicely there, and it seems like a real winning combination. But there is perhaps a game changer, namely the deinstitutionalization of the media landscape that we were so familiar with. So if you look at the increasing role of individuals or other organizations which wouldn't be subject to institutional structures, checks and balances, and ethics, what kind of lumps and bumps does that create, or how would you address that? Thank you.
Who would like to respond on that one?
Well, so I'll have a go first, because it's my lumps and bumps that have prompted the discussion. I was at a session yesterday talking about the opportunities and threats of the internet to journalism. And it was a very interesting discussion, because there was one line of argument that said we're on a trajectory and it's going in one direction. And if you look at the way that the internet is changing the business models of journalism, this is kind of all bad news. And there was another argument that said we're just in a transition. We've had lots and lots of transitions, and what happens is the market adapts to them as you go through, and it settles. And new players emerge, and they have different beliefs and values, and they occupy a different space in the media landscape. And we don't quite know where that's going to end. But so I suppose I don't have a complete answer to you, but I think it depends on the approach that you're going to take. If you assume we must capture everybody and deal with them as, we've got institutions arriving now who have a completely different business model, who have a totally different take on what they're amassing revenue for and where they're going to use it. And we need to now impose upon them the values of a group of people who have a totally different way of doing business and reason for being in the market. That will probably fail. What we'll have to do is to work out, as the market settles and develops and different patterns emerge and different players adopt their place, and different conventional, traditional media organizations work out how to balance dealing with somebody who is both essential to you and a rival and competitor, as, for instance, Google is to all journalistic organizations. Google is essential, it drives traffic, but it's also taking revenue. So what's the right approach? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I suspect it will settle at some point. I don't think we're on a downward dive, because that will just be destructive in the end, and people will, I'm sure, before the end, work out how to find new relationships. There will be different institutions with different ethics and different approaches. Our job, I think, or no longer our, your job as regulators and your job as broadcasters is to make sure that that central dynamo of that extraordinary ability to create institutions with a passion and a desire to achieve public policy goals, that is what we protect, and that is the virus that we keep going into the new system. The danger would be trying to make everybody look like that, because you'll weaken the ways that you can support those who really do it. So my view is you should focus on supporting the people who are really incentivized to take those public policy goals into the future, use competition law, use market measures to ensure that they have proper access to audiences and that they are protected in the appropriate way. So to Ross's point of putting media freedom firmly on the map, wholeheartedly agree with that. But rather than kind of imposing other rules upon them that they will resist and end up gaming.
Yes, Suzanne?
Maybe just because it's a little bit linked, and it targets again philosophical questions raised by Tim. I was just wondering, you said that broadcaster is special in having this link between context and content, and that's why we hold him liable and address him. I'm really wondering whether you could not say this also for a whole bunch of new services, which, you know, they structure their business such that they really capture their partners, the people who watch it, by offering services that they link, or content that is linked, and apps so that they cannot really get out. Do they not also generate a context, and in that way also a certain responsibility, and all of this also being then further reinforced by vertical structures, you know, where they really have a lot of leeway. They can go very far in directing the consumer and the consumer's habits. So I'm not sure that I would completely buy in. It's only the podcaster who we can, or who we should address if we take this approach, that responsibility is basically a factor combining context and content power.
Fair point. I think I would draw a distinction between two things. I think I was referring to the, as it were, the actual moment of consumption and the person who consumes, which I think is almost uniquely within the preserve of the broadcaster. When you're talking about the other kinds of capture, that, it seems to me, is it's the natural process of any market, isn't it? That any market will want to bundle as much as possible to create as complete a package for its consumers and to own that relationship with consumers. And then at some point, somebody will work out that actually there's a better way to do this, and it'll start unbundling. And you know, that's kind of naturally what happens. So everybody's going to want to own the consumer as far as possible until they find out that actually owning all of that much is alienating their consumers, and it's better to do it a different way. I think it's a slightly different market-based mechanism, but I take the point.
Yes, please.
My name is Taras Shevchenko. I'm from Ukraine, Director of Media Law Institute. Thanks a lot for your great presentations. I have two questions to ask. The first one is about proportionality, necessity, and relevant arguments for regulations. Are you really sure that the regulation that you suggest that we discuss for the new media would be in line with the European standards set by the European Court on Human Rights? And Suzanne raised the question about who may stop it. might it be European Court on Human Rights who will say that this is not necessary? Many of you use different terms, and Tim, for example, was saying about relevant arguments. But according to the necessity test, arguments for regulation should not be just relevant or reasonable. They should be necessary to preserve some reasons. And the second question about actually these reasons, one of idea was that it supports pluralism. Some cases from Ukraine would demonstrate absolutely contrary, that regulation is not preserving pluralism, but just supporting oligarchs. And that's the same argument, the same regulation. We really wait for a time when there would be freedom for everybody to transmit programs normally through internet. Because now, for example, the must carry provisions was used to get rid of probably the only TV station who is not loyal to the president, called TVI, because most of cable operators put on that slot the new TV station that is run by National Bank of Ukraine. The National Bank opened the Bank TV and invested already 10 million euros because the head of National Bank, who now moved to be a vice prime minister of Ukraine, has an idea of being a great politician, so he wants his own media. So because National Bank TV got a national license, they apply to must carry rules, and cable operators just said that we don't have enough places, so we get rid of TVI and we put National Bank TV, because our law obliges us to put Bank TV on that place. So must carry provisions, which normally also have a lot of goods with the good reasons when introduced, they are not used for pluralism. The same with the switch to digital broadcasting. It was used in Ukraine to get rid of opposition stations because of relicensing. And during relicensing, many local stations just didn't get the new license, and they will have to be switched off the air in a few years. So think about not only regulation about in developed countries, but also how it would apply in non-developed countries. And in many cases, it will not give any good. Thanks.
Many thanks for this very important question. I mean, actually, it encroaches on the second part of our debate, was what's about how, but maybe then we could, as a panelist, would have to answer your question and as well start to kind of briefly expose their thoughts on the on how could regulation, ecology. Look like? What would be the precondition? Is there an important precondition to as well to guarantee the freedom of speech and the proportionality and the necessity?
Well, I can give it a try. Although it's quite tricky because you're criticizing one of EPRA members. So. But let's face this situation. I think, well, this is something I wanted to address in the second part of the debate, but we can get rid of this aspect right now. Yes, probably in some situation it happens that regulation does not contribute to pluralism, but might threaten it. But well, this is not the kind of regulation I dream about for the future. I think there are a lot of things that should change in the way we see the future of regulation of media, and once again, be it old and new. And I think probably the main thing that should change is that regulators should adapt and way much more than they already knew now. Some of us probably are still in the kind of traditional legacy command and control type of regulation. I think all of us will slowly go away from this kind of regulation and hopefully privilege a regulation that will be more open, more transparent, more proportionate, and and more agile and more able to adapt to all the different situations, all the different players they are confronted to. But, well, it will take some time. It might take some more time in some countries than in some others, but I hope that all of us will do their part of their work and be able to contribute to the outcomes that you mentioned instead of some others that we can probably regret.
Yes, Ross.
Maybe I can say it more easily than Jean-Francois can in that case. I mean, I don't know that I know about the TVI case. I don't know the details. I don't know what sort of audience share it was getting, and so on. But it does seem to me that sort of event that's not necessarily a fault of the regulation system as it's written down. It's more the way in which it's implemented. And I think one of the things that be it the European Union, be it the OSCE, be it the Council of Europe, somebody needs to be quite specific about this. That we should have media regulators who don't have any ties with party politics. I mean, that seems to me to be a fairly basic precondition if we're going to have a system which actually encourages freedom, plurality, and a mature political debate. It's easier to say than to implement, and lots of established Western European democracies aren't there yet. But I think it should be an ambition for all of us.
I was recently on a panel in Tunis about 3 or 4 months ago, where there was a big issue there at that moment was the appointment to the board of public broadcasters and state-owned but nevertheless public service press. And the interim government appeared to be going back on its original intention to not interfere and had started sacking people and imposing its own. And so there was a conference organised, and I was sitting next to somebody from the BBC who talked about the way that the BBC organises its governance and its independence and so on. So as a good and important model, which of course it is. And so I followed this person by observing that I knew of a broadcaster where the board is entirely appointed by the government, where the funding is set exclusively by the government, where the remit is set exclusively by the government without any kind of parliamentary control or oversight or ratification, where it was customary for the chairman and the deputy chairman of the board to be politically, if informally, but nevertheless politically balanced in their views, and where the recent appointment of a director general, somebody had not got the job and was popularly believed not to have got it because he had actually been a political advisor to somebody beforehand. And this was, of course, the BBC, is the BBC. So an awful lot of it, to echo what Ross says, an awful lot of it is not to do with what's written on the page, it's to do with the political ethos that supports it and sustains it and makes it happen. And I have no idea about the details of the case, but I do know that what is written down for a regulator is frequently capable of use in a number of different ways, and the way it is used is to do with political culture every bit as much as it's to do with the way that the words are written.
And maybe to round this up and to get to the beginning of what you said, Taraj, to have hopes that this can be a case for the Court of Human Rights, well, I would rather hope not. I would hope that things are considered beforehand, because this cannot be the way we regulate the media of the future, to basically rectify the mistakes. So I think there we all agree, but you have, of course, a very important point, and I tried to sketch this out a little bit, so I'm not an expert in constitutional rights issues. It is definitely very, very needed to analyze how far you can go in regulating. And I think this also ties in well to what we've heard this morning from the United States. Maybe this making and putting the emphasis on the procedure is something that we are lacking. maybe we're discussing a lot about content and we're forgetting really what was so well spelled out in the morning, I found, how to ensure that whatever we agree upon later is actually taking place in the right way. And we carry it through. And this is maybe really an issue that could give a new impetus also to the discussion that takes place around the Audiovisual Media Service Directive.
I think, Jean-François, you wanted to directly go in the same direction as Suzanne and was briefly presenting a couple of slides.
Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry. And so the other question we had to raise was how would we regulate? And I think I would like three things that change and three things that should change. The thing that changed, this is Copyright Ofcom, my vice chairman of EPRA, Monica Arino. What is changing is that the regulatory matrix is getting actually more and more complex, as we can see here. We all know about the situation of Ofcom. We all think that it's very simple. Ofcom is the result of the merger of how many regulators, Tim? 9? 5? And so you think it's easy, and look at this. You can see that it remains quite complex. And the example here of access of person with disabilities to video-on-demand services, this is something that has been done with the contribution and the support of the industry. And this shows also that we will all have to engage in some kind of regulatory mix between self-regulation, co-regulation, regulation, and that you probably won't find European or worldwide answers to this. It will all depend on what topic do you self-regulate or co-regulate, and what's the situation in your country. You can again take the example of UK. If you have self-regulation, which is working quite well for advertising standards, and then you have self-regulation with the Press Council, which the least we can say is that it's not been working that well. What you can see also is that you have new problems that are emerging in regulation. This one is copyright Heiko Zisk, who is the vice president of ProSiebenSat, one of your members, and I wanted to make product placement for his presentation that you'll find on this website, because it's a really good one. He made a presentation about all the kinds of fragmentation that we have, cultural, economic, technical, regulatory fragmentation, etc. And what does this show? I think it shows that, well, we have a lot of problems, not only to be solved by regulators once again. The main one is that content delivery and content consumption are changing, and it can be good news for media players, because it allows them to bypass gatekeepers, traditional gatekeepers. It can give you global access to audiences. But on the other hand, you can see that with this slide that it brings also new gatekeepers in the media environment. It can be TV manufacturers, can be game consoles, search engines, EPG, systems of recommendations, etc. And I think all these new gatekeepers, real gatekeepers or potential gatekeepers, raise new policy concern and fair access to the new platform, neutrality of search engine, prominence of local and European content, prominence of public service media on the new platform, standardization between devices and between platforms. For example, if you want to make an application now with your media service, you might end up not to be forced to make one application, but maybe 10 or 20 different kind of application to access to all the different platforms. And this is really problematic for access to your audience. So I think we have all these new problems. Once again, it's not problems. Probably most of them are not for regulators, but we have to be aware about this. And the the last thing is the three things that yeah, this why am I talking to you about cheerleaders? I think that this is to show you that also there's one thing that is changing, is that everyone wants to enter the business of content. You can have telecom operators, cable operators, search engine, can be the press, social network, TV manufacturers, computer manufacturers, etc. Once again, it can be very good news for the consumer, but it might also, and this is going to answer, I think, also one of your question, is that it might endanger the ecosystem that has been patiently built in the past decades in Europe, and it's also something that Tim stressed. I'm always saying to some people who come to us to ask us to protect them to new entrants, that it's not our business to protect them against new entrants, and regulators are not there to protect dying businesses. And I've also heard, and this is my tribute to Russ telling us at the last EPRA meeting that he does not expect regulators to be cheerleaders of the industry. I think it's very important. But nevertheless, I think we have to safeguard the virtuous circle that we have in Europe, and which allows media players to have access to big audience, to make revenues from this audience, and to go back investing these revenues in European content. And then the three things that should change. Well, the first one we've already talked about, and even if it's not changing probably fast enough in some situation, well, we're trying to adapt. I think also we should be aware that entering the scope of regulation might be sometimes an opportunity. And I'll give you three quick examples. We have the main radio services in Belgium who just decided a few years ago to set up together a radio player like the one there is in UK, and they decided it's a private initiative, but they decided to associate the regulator to this initiative, and they decided that on this player they will be allowed to come on this player only the radio station that have registered to the CSA. I think regulation also can be a place, and this is something that I think Russ also stressed in one of our recent meetings, that you can have access to all this research about future trends in the sector that regulators are doing. And so if you enter this family of regulators, well, you have access to the work we can do, and which probably most of the media players don't have the time to work on. And the last thing I would like to mention is that I think it can also help new media players, and this is something you also stress, to have access to something which is not about regulation, but which is about contributing to some kind of social cohesion. And it can be the work we're doing on access to people with disabilities, to new media players. It can be the work we're doing on diversity, on television, on the way that gender issues are treated, on the way that minorities are shown, and finally on the quality of information, which is something that traditional media are very proud of. And so this is not, of course, about regulating information, which is about making some work towards having the public being more confident of the quality of information that you will find on new media, and making sure that it has some quality and can be impartial, and that if you don't believe in global warming, for example, well, you might want to have some more impartial information about it. That's all.
Thank you, Jean-François. Can I ask the panelists, I think time is running, to maybe have just one final word each, or what they see, wrap up, or add just a last... Yes, please.
How would you do this that you were talking about in your last point? Because that's a crucial thing, I think, and that is done for all other media, but it's not yet very much done for media on the internet. And there is a great how rising in my head.
Started to move media regulation, extend traditionally what was TV regulation to the internet, and I think it's a huge mistake, and I think that we should think a lot more, and we should be much more cautious in Europe before continuing in that direction in any way, because in many countries, and West and North European countries might be to some extent exceptions to that. In many countries, internet is the free space. And if we authorize the states to regulate it somewhat similarly to broadcast, then we do great damage to freedom of expression. I just wanted to state it quickly. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this very important comment.
Well, I think if I have a short flip through in my head of what I think might be really important in this debate, it is certainly to distinguish between the more theoretical discussion as to what would be worthwhile regulating, and thereby distinguishing maybe again where is content that in an ideal world with an ideal government society would not wish maybe to have, to see the potential of regulation as actually something that also promotes freedom of speech and is actively being used to this end. I think very much at the beginning Ross mentioned news, and I repeat news. This is definitely a very important thing to distinguish this on a certain theoretical level, to be clear that this needs to be placed against the background of reality and the uses and misuses that this can then all open the door for if you allow regulation. So there is a risk. There is maybe also a hope for certain goals, and then to say that indeed procedures might be very important. The last correcting instance of the court is there, but maybe comes in very late, seeing how fast everything develops. So we have to be really very careful. And other than that, I'm certainly the last one to recommend anything coming from the observatory.
Okay, two thoughts on the how to do it bit. I think in general we all tend to look at content regulation, media content regulation as being in a sort of bubble, and I think increasingly that's going to have to break down. For example, this famous level playing field, which is a vastly overused cliche, but it's been used again today. Yeah, I think I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that if a media company feels it is regulated more than its competitors, is media regulation the way to get that level playing field? I'm not sure it is, actually. I think actually the better way to do that is via competition law, which is by definition a little more flexible, a little more fast-moving. And we're beginning to see it. If you look at the ruling of the Competition Appeals Tribunal on the Ofcom Pay TV case last year, where they're looking at how online players are coming into the established content market, and they're saying you now have to take these people into account. They are now part of the overall business, and something that needs to be considered alongside conventional pay TV. So I think that might be a more intelligent route to go for companies who feel they want to have a level playing field with online competitors. Wait until such time as national competition authorities begin to define a video content market, regardless of whether it's delivered online or offline. So that would be the first point. The second point would be about network regulation. There's a fairly broad consensus across Europe that regulation of content and carriage should be kept separate. I think there's even a recital to that effect in the European telecoms package. Fine, okay, yes, keep them separate by all means, because they're doing different things. But I wonder whether in the content field we can look at some of the structures and mechanics in place in the telecoms framework and see whether this could be read across also to content regulation. For example, under the European telecoms regulation, member states have the right to determine whether a certain part of the market needs ex-ante regulation or whether there is sufficient competition. They don't all have to come to the same conclusion at the same time. In content regulation, by contrast, the AVMS directive says all markets must have the same rules on quantity of advertising, on production quotas and so on, regardless of whether they're big markets, small markets, profitable markets, markets in trouble. And I think one could, maybe one way out of this sort of black and white, should it be in, should it be out discussion is to say, well, maybe member states regulators could be empowered to decide whether regulation of TV advertising by the minute is still necessary, or whether there is now sufficient competition to drop some of these safeguards. So I think, okay, keep the two streams separate, because they're usually separate ministries that look at them as well. But I think some of the structures from the telecoms framework could usefully be read across into our areas as well.
Yes, to answer the how. I think first it's a question of mindset. You have some regulatory powers, and then there are thousands of ways to enforce it, and once again, it all depends on the on each different culture and on the way you want to enforce these this framework, and on the way you are going to interact with the players that you regulate. And if you try to go to them and explain them what is regulation and certainly what is not regulation, well, most of the time it works. We've been taking, when the scope of the directive was expanded, we took with each of the players that were falling into the scope of the directive days, weeks, months if needed, to explain them what's going to happen to them, and not forcing them to register and telling them, oh my God, now you're going to have to contribute to up to 5% of your revenues to film fund, etc. They said, don't worry, it won't be that, and if you are patient enough, it works. And I think the second thing is that you have to be as imaginative as you can, and as much as you can think outside of this legacy way of regulating. I know it's difficult because it's a crisis for most of us, and but in my authority, even if we have less and less resources, we try to put more and more resources in research, because we think that it is really something. It's important for us, and it's important for the people we regulate, that they have access to this research. We also try to engage in this research process with them. We counsel them. We ask them, what do you want us to research on? We invite them to research with us. We have several, the CSA is open to people who want to make research. They can apply, and then we invite them for 3 months, 6 months, and it can be people who are taking some time off from a media company, and they come they come at the CSA and work on a topic of on research for them. I think this builds confidence. We offer a prize for the best dissertation about media regulation issues. And we're also trying to invest energy on issues that are not about, once again, command and control regulation, diversity, accessibility, quality programming. And this is open to everyone. And I think all this, at the end of the day, might build the confidence between regulators and media players.
So just very briefly on the how, it seems to me that there are 4 basic players involved in the regulation of the future. There's the statutory regulators, there's the self-regulators, there's what you might describe as the accountable bodies for the delivery of public service, and there's the audience themselves. And what's going to happen in future is that the balance between them is going to change. So if you go back to my 3-part split of how we regulate, if it's access and protection and promotion of content, then I think access is going to remain very much the preserve of the statutory regulators. I think that's what statutory regulators do and should do, and to meet the point about protection of access, I think that's exactly what regulators should do. They should be there to establish the greatest possible freedom of expression and access to the greatest possible promotion of diversity of views, and then to guard that boundary absolutely. That's their job, is to promote freedom of expression, not to limit it. So I think that will be the job of regulators. I think the protection bit will be increasingly the job of self-regulators. I think that's their job. It's an alliance between the self-regulators and the audience to understand and create their own environments and understand what roles and responsibilities they have. And the contribution bit, I think, is going to be essentially a relationship between those who are accountable for the spending of public funds and those who are responsible for giving them the public funds and privileges in the first place, the government and the accountable bodies. It's not something I think regulators do terribly well. I think it's something that public service institutions are better incentivized to do. So I think what will happen in future is there'll be a greater delineation of responsibilities between the different players in the market. And that, I think, will be a good thing.
And I think on these good words, we'll slowly close the session because we're running after time. Would like to thank very much all the panelists. It will be, I think, very difficult to wrap up a very difficult exercise. We looked into. There was some key messages about the changes of the ecosystem that are already there still, but at the same time still with a resilience of TV. Then there's been key messages on the why regulation and some goals of media regulation that are enduring, relevant and necessary. Some public policy objectives are still valid, but some less so in the future, that there's not too much appetite, at least from the traditional regulator, to increase the scope of regulation. And then we looked a bit on the how and the regulatory matrix that will not probably be very simple, that will have several players, statutory, self, PSB bodies, the audience, and the shift between all these players. And the mix of the tools, the regulatory tools, that will be an important key message, maybe that the outcomes matter more than the structure, that the regulators must change from this command and control regulation to be more transparent, proportionate, and agile in their approach to regulation, and keep the essence of the rule rather than maybe the detail. Yes, we didn't discuss very much at the end on the role of media literacy in this new, which is probably something important. I think on this good word, and I'll say thank you to for the audience for staying with us. Yes.